Our first speaker is Duncan Purves from the University of Florida. He is going to be talking about predictive policing, whether it's unbiased and unfair, unbiased or unfair. The format is going to be that speakers are going to talk for about 20 or 30 minutes. I'll give you a 5-minute warning beforehand. And then we have a commentator for about 5 minutes, and then we open it up for so, Duncan?
Yes. All right. So thanks to Kay for hosting this conference and for letting me come. And thanks to Diana and Katie for working so hard to help with the logistics. They've been incredibly helpful. So jumping right in, a program called PredPol has become the most widely used predictive policing software in the United States. Beginning early this decade, the LAPD began using PredPol to generate heat maps, so-called heat maps, of 500 by 500 square foot boxes displayed on a tablet indicating high-risk areas for motor vehicle theft and burglary or theft from a vehicle. So PredPol generates forecasts using data about the type, location, and time of crime, and additional data from recent crime reports can be incorporated daily to update the program's forecasts. Now, the purpose of directing officers to these boxes is as much to be seen as it is to see. So the idea is that police can deter crime simply by being more visible in high-risk areas at high-risk times of day. So in 2018, LAPD officers spent a total of 28,264 hours in the boxes. Now that might sound like a ton of time, but this amounts to only between 15 and 45 minutes per shift, per officer, per day. So over 60 police departments across the country have used or are currently using PredPol. That number might be larger since I wrote that. So it'll be no surprise to the participants of this conference that predictive policing is controversial. In 2016, the ACLU, along with 16 other civil rights, technology, and philanthropic organizations, signed a statement listing some of the civil rights concerns associated with predictive policing. Commentaries have been published in Nature and Vice and elsewhere, calling for predictive policing to reform to address concerns about unfairness, bias, and discrimination against communities of color, particularly predominantly Black communities. So in this paper, I'm going to focus on two versions of this criticism that predictive policing is unfair to Black communities in particular. First, I will address a frequently voiced concern that predictive policing algorithms are unfair to Black communities because they rely on racially biased data in generating and updating their forecasts. I will argue that this objection is reason for concern, but I don't think it's decisive or presents a conclusive case against the use of predictive policing. Though there are reasons to worry that data generated by discovered crime, so arrests, for example, overestimate crime rates in Black communities. Data generated by reported crime might systematically underestimate crime in those communities. And I'll say a little bit about why that might be. So the thought is, once you combine these two sets of data, you might get a more accurate picture, or you might actually need to provide different weights to different types of data, depending on how they're generated. I will then explore what I think to be a more promising, or perhaps more difficult fairness-based objection to predictive policing. According to this objection, predictive policing is unfair because, like racial profiling, it unequally burdens innocent members of minority communities. Now, I advance what I take to be the strongest version of this objection to predictive policing, and then consider a reply that might be offered by its defenders. According to the reply that I address, the unequal burdens that predictive policing places on Black communities are not unfair because those same communities also enjoy unequal crime reduction benefits, right, that outweighs those burdens. So for the sake of argument, I will concede that predictive policing delivers unequal crime reduction benefits that might outweigh the burdens that it places on Black communities. But nonetheless, I will argue, even if that's the case, predictive policing might still be unfair. Okay. In particular, I'm going to argue that when innocent members of black communities validly refuse consent to unequal police attention driven by algorithmic forecasts, the benefits of that unequal attention cannot justify the disproportionate harms that predictive policing visits on those members. In these cases, predictive policing remains unfair. And that will take us in, that will require a sort of foray into the philosophical ethics of third-party defense. So that'll take some time during the presentation. Okay, so I was going to spend some time in this presentation talking about why we should think predictive policing in principle can work at reducing crime, but I realized when I did that, my presentation lasted like 30 minutes. So what I'm going to say is this, and we can talk more about this in the Q&A. It is my estimation, based on the research that I have done, the literature review that I have done, that in principle, the criminological theory that supports the effectiveness of hotspots policing also supports the in-principle effectiveness of predictive policing. Okay? The thought is, crime is importantly connected to place, and so by targeting high-risk places where the majority of criminal activity is concentrated, we can expect to generate crime reduction benefits. There is empirical support for the claim that hotspots policing does produce modest crime reduction benefits, and that these crime reduction benefits can be diffused into the surrounding areas around the targeted high-risk areas. So I think there is, in principle, support for predictive policing's effectiveness at reducing crime. I think the empirical literature is very much mixed, partly because it's a new technology. The empirical literature is very much undecided. Some studies of predictive policing software have seemed to have shown significant crime reduction benefits. Others have shown the opposite, that it's completely ineffective. Okay? And a recent literature review of all the existing studies found that there's no conclusive evidence to support the claim that predictive policing is more effective than traditional measures at reducing crime. But I think the jury is still out on that. Okay, so we might expect future studies to show more support. So let's turn to the first objection, the first fairness-based objection to predictive policing. So I think the most common objection you run into against predictive policing in both popular venues but also in academic publications is that algorithmic forecasts are based in part on biased arrest data. Okay? So arrest data is biased in the sense that it is driven by historical racial bias by police officers. So we should expect forecasts that are based on arrest data simply to replicate the historical bias of policing practices against communities of color. The idea is that algorithms trained on biased arrest data will recommend greater police presence in an area on the basis of that data. Once there are more officers in a community, this will yield more arrests, which will be used as a proxy for higher crime rates, which are then used to justify greater police presence. And on we go. Okay, so sometimes this is called the self-fulfilling prophecy or runaway feedback loops problem. Right? As Casper Lippert Rasmussen has put the point, to the extent that a certain statistical fact is the causal result of a certain policy of differential treatment, that policy cannot be justified by appeal to this statistical fact. So if predictive policing has the result that officers are targeting communities of color out of proportion to the actual rate of criminal activity in those communities, then predictive policing results in an ineffective use of policing resources. Okay? But by being ineffective, it would seem also to be unfair. Because I think a plausible constraint on fair policing is something like the following, called the unequal burdens principle. Okay. So this principle just says, imposing unequal burdens of policing on a subset of the population of innocent citizens is fair only if doing so is necessary to achieve valuable aims of policing, So predictive policing certainly imposes unequal burdens on a subset of innocent people. So though it targets places rather than people, right, it does not target people on the basis of race, individuals who live in designated high-risk areas are de facto targeted for extra police attention. They are therefore more likely to interact with police via stop, seizure, search, or arrest than people who live or work elsewhere. And increased police contact in those areas raises the probability of mistaken search, seizure, arrest, or conviction, right? And this can lead to a litany of harms, all right? These are some that people identify in the literature, right? We have restriction of freedom of movement, threats to informational privacy, loss of autonomy, restrictions on individual expression and creativity, right? Feel like they're being watched all the time, violations of dignity, the perception of a lack of respect by members of the community, and a sense of inferior political status. This is a harm recently identified by a member of the philosophy department here at Northeastern. It's a very good paper. I can send you the citation if you'd like it. I don't think Adam's here though. So, of course, there's also physical harm, right, that innocent members of the community face as well. There's evidence that Black Americans are already 3.5 times more likely than white Americans to be the victims of a police shooting. When there are more police in an area, especially when the area is designated as high risk for homicide or burglary, common sense tells us that the probability increases that an innocent person will have a harmful interaction with police. So, because the self-fulfilling prophecy objection is a powerful reason to doubt that the unequal imposition of these harms is necessary to achieve the morally valuable aims of policing, predictive policing seems to violate the unequal burdens principle. Okay. Now, the reason, and so here's a statement of this type of concern by Ezekiel Edwards, director of the ACLU Criminal Law Reform Project. Now, the reason I don't think this objection is decisive against predictive policing, and here I could be corrected by the people who are better with data than I am, but it seems to me that some proponents of predictive policing are attempting to address this self-fulfilling prophecy problem. So it's my understanding that the LAPD's experiment with predictive policing ignored arrests and focused instead on reported crime. Of this model, Sean Malinkowski of the LAPD said, and I quote, "We stress that this strategy develops and plots forecasts based on a 3-year look at crime patterns, and that arrests are not part of the equation. If the police deploy to an area due to a forecast based on crime and arrests, and do in fact make additional arrests that go back into the model, it could skew further forecasting. In our model, we would hope to deploy officers based on crime only." So, one way to use crime data without arrest data is to use crime reports. Okay? Reports about the time, place, and type of crime, or emergency calls for service. Okay? These are calls for service placed by members of the community. Right? If I walk out to my car, I see that someone has smashed open my window, stolen my laptop, right? You get an emergency call for service, you get a community-generated crime report. Now, crime reports and emergency calls for service are initiated by members of the community, and so are much more likely to reflect an actual crime occurrence than, say, an arrest, which can reflect really only discovered crime, or even just officers' suspicion of crime. Right? You can be arrested and detained without ultimately being convicted of anything at all. Right? So importantly, right, this data, crime report data, is generated by community members and not by, say, officers looking for Black members of the community to target, right, for investigation. And importantly, crime data generated from community crime reports and emergency calls for service might actually underestimate the amount of some types of crime in low-income and minority communities. So, this is just one piece of evidence. So a recent Cato Institute survey found that while 78% of white Americans say they would definitely report a violent crime they witnessed, only 54% of African Americans and 57% of Hispanics are so confident. The survey also found that households making less than $30,000 a year and high school graduates are considerably less likely than those making more than $60,000 a year or college graduates to be confident that they would report a violent crime they witnessed. Now, you might say, well, this is surely the product of some sort of perverse relationship between poor people and minorities and the police, and that might very well be right. But nonetheless, it is some reason to think that for some types of crime, you might actually think that community-generated crime reporting underestimates how much crime is taking place in certain communities. So we may eventually have to concede that some crimes track race, insofar as other drivers of crime correlate with race. So as Andrew Ferguson has written, so he's a legal scholar working on Fourth Amendment issues surrounding predictive policing. He said, the predicted boxes of heightened gun violence may correlate with poor communities of color, but that is also he's talking about shootings, homicides. That's also where the shootings happen. The bias lies not in the algorithm, but in the real-world facts going into the system. Now, I don't want to sort of wholly side with Ferguson here, but I do want to suggest that these observations about underreporting of certain types of crime, I mean, they're not the end of the self-fulfilling prophecy objection, but I do think they are sufficient to show that it is inconclusive, okay? Even if predictive policing software is using biased arrest data now, it's not clear that in principle it needs to. And in fact, some measures have been taken by proponents of predictive policing to address this self-fulfilling prophecy problem. So I want to sort of set aside the popular self-fulfilling prophecy objection on the grounds that it's inconclusive. I don't think that predictive policing algorithms need to fall prey to that particular issue. So I don't think predictive policing algorithms need to violate the unequal burdens principle. However, I want to suggest in the rest of this paper that predictive policing might be unfair for other reasons, even when it is not based on biased data, and even when it reflects community crime rates with perfect accuracy. So being accurate and being effective is not good enough for fairness. So briefly turning to a practice to which predictive policing is often compared, racial profiling is often objected to on the grounds that it results in an unfair burden of law enforcement being placed on innocent minorities for the sake of promoting the greater social good. Okay? So even if racial profiling is effective, because members of certain racial groups commit crimes at higher rates than members of other groups, it is nonetheless unfair to impose the burdens of law enforcement disproportionately on innocent members of those racial groups for the sake of benefiting the rest of us. Okay? So, for example, if the police use race as a factor when making traffic stops, then innocent black motorists will suffer a disproportionate share of the burden of policing. And yet, the objection goes, the benefits of crime reduction that are supposedly generated by disproportionately burdening black motorists will be roughly evenly distributed throughout society. Okay. It is commonly accepted that it is unfair to harm innocent people for the sake of benefiting others. So the unfairness objection concludes racial profiling is unfair to minorities, even when it is more effective than other measures at reducing crime. Okay. And again, right, these are some of the types of harms that we might expect, in addition to physical harm for innocent members of minority communities. Now, I think a similar worry to this concern can be raised for predictive policing. Right? When predictive policing recommends a disproportionate distribution of police patrols in black communities, it raises the probability that innocent members of those communities will have a harmful encounter with police. And for the reasons I've already discussed, innocent people in those communities are then disproportionately burdened for the sake of crime benefits that are enjoyed by others. Okay? So the thought is, when a black community is targeted for additional patrols, and say we then reduce, as a result, we reduce the amount of vehicle burglary, right? I will benefit from this, even though I'm not one of the people that was at risk of being burdened by the additional police presence, because I don't live in this community. Right? I benefit, but I don't take on the risk. So one reply to the objection that predictive policing is unfair, in the way I've just described, is that a policing practice is not unfair so long as the policing practice unequally benefits the very people that it unequally burdens, right, in a way that, such that the benefits outweigh those burdens. Okay. So about racial profiling, Matthias Rissa and Richard Zeckhauser have written, and here's a quote, "We submit that a sufficient condition for imposing unequal burdens is that those burdened more are net beneficiaries from that public good. If the unequal imposition of a burden is counterbalanced by a net benefit that the relevant group gains, the unequal burden is not undue." And in defense of racial profiling, philosopher David Boonin has written, "If a practice disproportionately benefits black Americans, then it's not clear why it would be unfair for it to also disproportionately burden them." And there are some reasons to think that black Americans benefit disproportionately, say, from violent crime reduction. In 2015, of the about 13,500 homicide cases where the FBI listed a victim's racial information, 52.3% of victims were black, and 43.5% were white. This is despite the fact that blacks comprise just 13.3% of the US population, whereas whites comprise 77.1% of the US population. Now, I think this discrepancy is remarkable. It's worth noting. So, while predictive policing burdens innocent black Americans unequally by increasing the police presence in black communities, according to this reply to this unfairness objection, predictive policing also unequally benefits black Americans by reducing crime and promoting security. And of course, unlike racial profiling, which I think many of us find intuitively repugnant, predictive policing reduces crime, assuming it's effective, in black communities without targeting people on the basis of race. Now, it targets people on the basis of perhaps features that correlate with race, but it doesn't target people on the basis of race in the way that racial profiling does. Because predictive policing benefits the very communities it disproportionately burdens, this reply goes, it is not unfair. It's not unfair to those communities. Now, I am not in a position to assess how the benefits of predictive policing for innocent members of communities of color stack up against the various burdens. In fact, I don't think anyone's in that position right now. So instead of trying to perform a kind of difficult cost-benefit analysis, which I'm not qualified to do, I want to suggest that even if the burdens of predictive policing significantly outweighed the burdens for black communities, predictive policing might still be unfair. Okay, so you grant this sort of empirical claim, I still think you can get an unfairness problem. So my argument requires a foray, somewhat circuitous foray, into the ethics of third-party defense. Cases of third-party defense are cases where a rescuer can defend an innocent victim from an aggressor only by harming the aggressor. Okay, so a simple case, a simple philosopher's case, so excuse the, the silly nature of the example. So elevator one, that's what we'll call it. This is borrowed from Jonathan Perry's article on the ethics of third-party defense in Philosophy of Public Affairs. Victim is taking a ride in an elevator. Aggressor begins to saw through the elevator cable because he hates victim and wishes him dead. Rescuer is walking by and is able to shoot aggressor with her sniper rifle, thereby saving victim. I assume the doors must just be closing, right, on the elevator as they walk by. However, victim refuses intervention because he is deeply committed to nonviolence. Okay. Everyone get the case? Okay. Now, Perry takes it as obvious, and I share this intuition, that it would be wrong for rescuer to intervene in elevator 1, given that victim has refused intervention on the basis of a deeply held moral commitment. Okay, and I think to get more traction, in defense of this type of intuition, we can look at sort of cases in medicine. Right? If I refuse medical intervention for myself on the basis of a deeply held moral commitment, it seems like a physician should recognize and respect my authority over how I'm treated. This is supposed to be a similar case to that. So, a plausible view, a widely held view, is that something like this consent requirement governs the ethics of cases of third-party defense. 5 minutes. Other defense is morally justified only if those to be defended do not validly refuse defensive intervention. So the reason it's wrong for rescuer to intervene in elevator 1 is that I am the only victim whose good is at stake, and I validly refused intervention on the basis of my deeply held moral commitments. Now, I think this requirement is attractive insofar as it is anti-paternalist. As Perry says, it's the victim's life that is at stake, not anybody else's. And so only he gets to decide if and how it is defended. On these matters, the individual is sovereign. If the relationship between police, innocent members of minority communities, and the criminal elements of those communities is analogous to cases involving cases like third-party defense, right, where you have a rescuer, a victim, and an aggressor. This observation from Perry helps us to see where the reply to the unfairness objection goes wrong. Because in these cases, I think we do have, and I think there are reasons to think there's an analogy here. Right? You have an aggressor, a criminal element of a community, who threatens unjustified harm to the innocent members of that community. You have a rescuer, the police. They have the ability to prevent the threatened harm by imposing defensive harm on the aggressor, right? Apprehending the criminal. And defending every victim, every member of the community, is a condition of defending any, right? When police are out on the street, right, patrolling a community, that police presence it has the effect of deterring crime for everyone who happens to find themselves in the area, not just selected individuals. And one subset of the members, and here's an important condition, one subset of the members of the victim group consents to defensive intervention and another refuses. This is where things become morally murky. So in Black communities, and I'll return to this later, it's not clear what people's attitudes are toward police intervention or towards police intervention through predictive policing forecasts. Okay? I wouldn't be surprised if some members of those communities endorse predictive policing and others find it abhorrent or untrustworthy. Okay, so that would be a reasonable thing. So let's just take for granted for now that we do have a case of third-party defense in the relationship between police, criminals, and innocent members of Black communities. So, under what circumstances is intervention permitted? Okay. In these cases. Okay. So, when is it okay for the police to intervene in these communities using predictive policing? Well, I want you to consider, it's supposed to be, so here's another multiple victim case of third-party defense. So 5 victims are taking a ride in an elevator. Aggressor begins to saw through the elevator cable again because he hates all of the victims and wishes them dead. Rescuer is walking by and able to shoot aggressor with a sniper rifle, thereby saving victims. However, while one victim consents to rescuer's intervention, one does, the four remaining, I take it this guy consents and he's trying to convince the other ones, the four remaining victims refuse because of their deep commitment to nonviolence. Okay. Now, Perry, and I agree, think that in this case it would be permissible for rescuer to intervene to save all 5 victims, even though 4 of them refuse consent. And here's a suggestion why. Okay, call this cool. I'm going to forfeit my reply time so I can get through this. Okay, my reply to John. So give me a couple extra minutes. Each of us has powers of control regarding whether and for what purposes others may use our good. Okay. Just as I can exclude you from using my body or property by withholding my consent, I have the power to prevent you from justifying your actions by appealing to the fact that you will benefit me by repudiating those benefits. By exercising this power, I render my good morally inadmissible for the purposes of justifying your action. And you commit a form of trespass against me if you attempt to do so. So I think that this principle can explain the wrongness of rescuer intervening in elevator 1. I think it can explain why it's okay to intervene in elevator 2. Okay. Because the one person who consents, their good, their well-being, is sufficient reason to intervene by harming aggressor. Even though the other 4 victims' well-being is off limits as a type of justification of intervention. So securing consent becomes especially important when defending some victims imposes a risk of harm on both aggressors and innocent bystanders. This is because it is particularly difficult to justify harming innocent people. If something like PPE is true, then in a case where a defensive intervention imposes significant harms on innocent people, and where the beneficiaries of the intervention have refused the intervention is extremely difficult to justify. This is because all we're left with in our moral ledger, when we're weighing all the reasons we have to intervene, are the harms the intervention imposes on innocent people. Okay. We can't appeal to the benefits to the beneficiaries, right? They have not consented. They've withheld their consent, right? So we can no longer justify our action. So returning to predictive policing, we've seen that predictive policing involves an unequal imposition of harm on innocent members of Black communities. The principle of prudential exclusion tells us that the benefits of predictive policing morally justify the practice only when those benefits accrue to community members who have consented. Only these benefits can be used to justify the unequal imposition of harms. So to find out whether a policy of predictive policing is justified, we can ask, if the validly refusing members of a community did not exist, would the harm to innocent members of the community be outweighed by the crime reduction benefits only to the consenting members? And if the answer is no, then the unequal imposition of burdens on innocent members of the community by predictive policing is unfair. The upshot of this somewhat circuitous discussion, and I'm wrapping up right now, is that it's not enough to respond to the charge of unfairness to show that predictive policing yields benefits that outweigh the harms to minority communities. It must also be shown that a sufficiently large number of the beneficiaries can be understood as not having validly refused consent to predictive policing. And in the Q&A, we can talk about whether we should think that, if there's any reason to think that members of Black communities have withheld consent or have consented to predictive policing. I think there's good reason to think that they probably have not, though there's not a lot of evidence of that. Okay, thanks.
Hi everyone, I'm John Basil. I'm a philosopher, obviously, here at Northeastern. Thanks, Duncan, for a really great talk, and I really enjoyed reading the paper. I really like the paper. It draws on, it's careful about the empirical details. It is really careful about when to do philosophy and when to do science, or what's roughly science. It's about a specific target. It's not sort of something about all algorithms. I really like that it's context sensitive. And I really like that it brings a bunch of philosophical discourses into touch with one another. The literature on third-party defense and just defensive harms generally is very robust and has a long history, and so it's a really useful tool to draw on because they've already had a bunch of arguments, so we don't have to do everything from whole cloth. I just want to raise a couple of questions, maybe one objection, and then I'll turn it over. Maybe there'll be a little time for Doug to respond, but if not, I'll turn it over to Q&A. So I have a question about how we're supposed to understand the lesson from thinking about defensive harms. So first, let me quickly summarize the dialectic just to make sure I'm on track, and then highlight two different ways to understand the lesson. So there's this objection from racial profiling that says, what's wrong with racial profiling is that it violates our requirement of commensurate burdens and benefits. We shouldn't impose a cost on others to benefit ourselves, roughly. And then there's an objection to that says, whoa, forget the principle of commensurate burdens and benefits. What we should focus on is an outweighing consideration. When we're going to impose burdens on a community, we just ask, do the benefits that community gets outweigh those burdens? It's not about a commensurate distribution with respect to the larger group. And then Duncan says, well, wait a minute, but if we think about predictive policing from the defensive harm framework, we can draw on resources there to see what that tells us about fairness. So just don't think about the outweighing principle quite yet. Instead, let's think about what we learned from thinking about defensive harms. And here's where I have a question about what the lesson's supposed to be. So here's lesson one, what you could take the lesson to be. Outweighing is a necessary but not sufficient condition for judging that predictive policing is fair. Yes, maybe we need to satisfy outweighing, but in addition, we also need some form of consent. On this version or lesson, consent acts as a side constraint on defensive intervention. If it's satisfied, then we go ahead and do the weighing up as proponents of outweighing suggest. That's one way to draw it. I don't think, there's some things he says that I think suggest that lesson, there's other things I think suggest the second lesson. When we see how consent functions in justifying, this is lesson 2. When we see how consent functions in justifying defensive harms, we'll see that when it's time to do the weighing, we can only weigh the benefits accrued to those that consent. So it's not that let's get consent and then do a weighing up. It's that the weighing up is modified by only those people that consent to the intervention. And that's not just a technical, philosophical, or idle difference. If lesson 1, it's much easier to satisfy the requirement. Well, you still have to get into this question about how much of the group has to consent, but in the elevator case, one member consents, and that's enough. And I take it in the elevator case, you are harming the pacifists. You're acting in a way that's against their interests. So that one person's consent is enough to justify this decision on behalf of the group. So it's a much easier condition to satisfy in the second case, where if it's not a consent requirement, it's just that consent alters how we do the weighing, it's going to make it much harder to justify defensive intervention. Because you're going to take all the people that didn't consent and their well-being's not going to figure into your decisions. Right? And I'm not sure which of those lessons to draw, and I'd like to hear more about that, but we have to be really careful about which one it's going to be when we're assessing the fairness of predictive policing. One is going to require different philosophical projects, going to be figuring out a concept of group consent that's not really tied to well-being. The other is going to have involve a bunch of hard questions about just measurement of well-being, for finding out who's consented or not, and then just do the outweighing procedure that they're doing anyway. So I have that question about what the lesson is. I also have this, I just have a different view about the standard elevator case, and in Duncan's paper that I read in the presentation, he just sort of says, I hope you'll agree with me about this intuition, and that's totally fine. My guess is in the defensive harms literature is great in some sense that it's robust, but it also feels to me like a very insular community to have all their own views about these things, and they're talking to each other a lot. When I thought about the elevator case, I'm coming at it from an entirely different perspective, discussions about welfare and well-being. And one of the standard objections to what are called actual preference satisfaction views, which is a view on just your life goes better to the extent that your actual preference is satisfied. One objection to that is the response we have to people who are suicidal. We think it's often justified to prevent someone from committing suicide, despite the fact that their actual preferences are such that that's what would make their life go better. And so we say, we're justified in intervening until at least we find out that they're not terminal and in severe pain, or we try to find out facts about them that we would say these aren't ideal. We want to confirm that their actual preference align with what might be fully rational preferences, and only then would we be justified in allowing them to end their own life. Now, I don't actually have a particular view about which, well, I do have a particular view about which theory of welfare is true, but I'm not convinced about whether to use idealized or actual preferences. And so I'm not sure what the lesson is. Maybe you could convince me that a pacifist that wanted to like allow for the killing of someone else at the cost of their own is fully rational or something like that. But I think you actually have to settle these questions of welfare. If you come from the welfare perspective as opposed to the defensive harms perspective, you might have an entirely different take on the elevator case. Yep, and that's my time. Thanks.